Buonasera a tutti e benvenuti a questa nuova puntata di The Flywheel Show, un'altra delle nostre Leviathan Nights. Questa sera abbiamo con noi Jim Rugg, che è l'autore di un volume che uscirà tra pochissimo tempo in Italia, che è Street Angel. So, Jim, welcome to the Flywheel Show, welcome to Leviathan Nights. First of all, how you're passing these first days of the year?
They're good. I'm working on another book, so they are busy.
Good to know. It's a typical question that I normally do with creators, but I suppose that more or less the answer is more or less the same. How you felt with the pandemic? How changed your creative life during these 2 years?
It's changed less than most people. I work from home. I've worked from home for 15 years.
Yeah,
So, in terms of work, I've kept busy and my schedule is pretty much the same as it has been. Um, the adjustment is everybody around me, my wife and family, friends and neighbors. I remember when the pandemic started, it was such a big deal for everybody to be at home. I had gone through that when I had a day job for many years before I started working from home, and it was a huge adjustment. And so when everybody around me joined me for working from home, I could see that adjustment again in
yeah.
their lives. But I've been very fortunate through the pandemic, so I've kept busy and work has been good. I did a Kickstarter during the pandemic because one of my comic book projects was put on hold. Um,
Yeah.
the book that's coming out now, the book I'm working on now, is Hulk Grand Design. And early in the pandemic, Marvel had all of their artists stop working for a little bit. And in that time, I did a Kickstarter with Octobriana, the world's first blacklight comic. So in some ways, I've been busier than ever. That was my first crowd fund, and it was a lot of work. But knock on wood, I can't complain.
Well, it's good because it seems you have this time to create more and enjoy more your activities. So it's well, it's good for your activities. So, would you like to tell something about Street Angels to the Italian fan, because the character is not so well known, so it could be interesting for everybody that is listening to know a little more about the character.
Street Angel is a homeless ninja on a skateboard. That's the short description. Um,
Absolutely.
she's a superhero, but she doesn't look like your typical superhero. And a lot of superheroes, we want to be them. They're our fantasies, and nobody fantasizes about being Street Angel. She has a difficult life, but she's a very good ninja, and so she does okay for herself.
It is interesting because even if it's not the typical superhero comic book, almost on every page you breathe the sense of a comic book. You feel the love for this kind of characters. So how deep is your relationship with the stereotypes of the superheroes, or how you started loving superheroes before working on Street Angels?
I grew up with Street Angels. Or with superheroes. My first comic books were Marvel and DC superhero comics. It's what I could find. They used to be you could find them at gas stations and drugstores, and that was all the comic books I could find for the first couple years that I read comic books. So I loved them. They're what made me want to draw comics. As I got older and I started to find other comics, my tastes, expanded, and now I like all sorts of comics, from manga to, slice of life and nonfiction. And, I like all comics, but I started out with superhero comics.
I think it's quite interesting because reading comic books from the latest 10 years, more or less, you feel a good way of mixing cultures. So it's much more different. I mean, I grew up reading comics in the 90s. In the 90s, you had superhero American comics, you've got manga, you've got Italian or French comics, but they were very well divided. You were able to understand where things were coming from. One interesting thing that I really love is the fact that now it's a melting pot. So everywhere you can feel different influences put together.
Yeah, that started. I grew up reading comics in the '90s also, in America, we had the superhero comics that we called mainstream, which is
Yeah, of
weird,
course.
um, and we had alternative comics, and the two were very different. You liked one or the other, you made one or the other, and I'm not sure when that changed, but I liked all of them. So once I started making comics in the early 2000s, I just brought in any influence I had, any idea that I liked. It didn't matter where it came from. And now I think that's pretty standard. I think we're all looking at comics, especially online. We don't know where they come from when we first find something we love. It could be, it could be Italian, French, Japan, as you mentioned. And it's just that we're attracted to all these things. And so they influence us. And now, comics are in a lot of ways very, very different than they were when I started reading them. And they were like Marvel had a house style, and DC had a house style, and Archie had a house style. And now it feels like any styles will work at most of these companies. And it's exciting, it's different. But
Yeah.
I hope some of that is in Street Angel, because I'm influenced by so many different creators, and I think that comes through on my pages.
Absolutely. That was our reading your comic book, because we have the same age, because I am from 77 too, so we probably had the same experiences talking about cultural events. So when I was reading your comic book, I see something that was very, very related to cartoons from the 90s, Beavis and Butthead, Daria, but also Ghost World. Uh, Too many things put together that created a sort of a background that make me feel that we were from from the same area, from the same artistic area, at least. So it's interesting, because when you read your comic book, there is of course the comics influences, there is the alternative, the indie influences, but there are too many things put together. It is very interesting the way you were able to engineer all these things and make them work in one story.
Thank you. I love hearing that. You don't want to copy someone else, and the way you avoid it, I think, is you just have you copy 10,000 other things instead of one. And it also happens because I'm still a comics reader, so
Mhm.
I hope I'm still growing and changing, and bringing in new influences. The part about being born in 1977, I'm also born in 1977, so we're literally from the same year. I think that's one of the biggest things people have in common, because you end up seeing the same television shows or the same big news events.
Exactly.
It's just it's a huge common experience, if you're a similar age.
Exactly. And just out of curiosity, because between many things that I found in your comic book, I see that Jess is a ninja. She has a katana. She loves pizza, because there is one of the stories in which pizza is really, really an important issue. And at a certain point in the third stories, she sees a mouse trying to steal a sandwich. So there is something related to Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, or is just an impression?
The Ninja Turtles are important to me.
Okay.
You can see one here behind me. This
Oh,
was
wow.
they're very near and dear to my heart.
Okay.
One, I grew up with the cartoons and the movies, but they were also creator owned, and
Yeah.
they were one of the first creator owned comics that I learned about. And so that was very exciting. When I was a kid, I wanted to make comics, and you could draw Spider-Man or Batman, but you didn't own them. And when I learned about the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, that was, it was like I like them to start with, but I like them even more now that I know that the guys that created them had this success, as creators. And so that part's always been an inspiration to me. And there's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles DNA in Street Angel.
Good to know. But I mean, there was a strong do-it-yourself attitude in that comic books, because they were creator-owned. So it's the same thing that started in Mage Comics in '92. So I guess this is a sort of punk attitude, more or less.
It is. And also, with the punk attitude is like DIY, do it yourself. And when I started making comics, Marvel Comics had gone bankrupt. And
Yeah.
it looked like the comics industry was sort of, maybe comic books were over. And I would just make photocopied comics, mini comics, and I would pass those around to friends. And I knew other people that did the same thing. And we all loved making comics, but it didn't look like there was a future. It looked like we'll just make comics and share them with the few other people that like comic books still. And then, of course, graphic novels take off and image comics has a renaissance. And, now it's a great time to be a comic book maker once again. But there was a time when it was like, I was making them completely myself, printing them, folding them in half, stapling them, just doing everything myself. And there were cartoonists I knew that were very influenced by punk, the movement of punk. And
Sure.
some of that rubbed off. I found a lot of attractive qualities in that movement and the idea of like, make it yourself, do it yourself, and, find a way to make it look good or look cool or look different than whatever Marvel and DC were making.
Well, it is interesting because in the book there is a lot of notes about how you work. So many of the things that I'm going to ask to you, I already know a little bit of the answer, but of course I want to show them to the audience. But it is interesting because one of the part of the process of the creation of the comic is that you create your own self comics even now, before starting and discussing with Image or the other editors. So you still kept that DIY attitude.
Yes, and sometimes I make them myself to see how they actually look, because you draw them bigger than they're going to be printed. Sometimes they print too dark if you're not careful. So that's the reason that I'll make my own version, and then I'll see something and change it a little bit, try to make it better whenever I can. And I like actually making the stuff. I get a thrill the first time I put the story together. I'll print them at a local print shop and just make 10 of them for myself to look at and make notes and try to make them better. But that part's exciting to me. That first moment whenever I actually put it together and it looks like a book, that's magic. That's exciting to me.
So I must suppose that you have something on your own that you do not publish or you keep for yourself.
Not really. Most of what I make, I share, usually on social media. I also do a YouTube channel, so I post things on there. Some of the stuff that if I'm not sharing it, it's because it hasn't been announced yet. It may be something
Okay.
that's coming up. But for the most part, I tend to, put my work out there in some form or another, even if it's rough. Maybe I'll put it on my Patreon, and you get sort of an inside look at my process there, or maybe a sketchbook or something that might not be public. But if people are interested, I'm happy to share my work.
Sure, of
I
course.
I often tell the story. My very first comic book show, I gave somebody one of my comics because I wasn't selling them. No one wanted them. And the person gave it back to me. So I always say, like, there was a time I couldn't even give my work away. So, if there's an audience that's interested in what I do, I'm happy to share that.
Absolutely, absolutely. And in the Street Angel, you are collaborating with Brian Maruca. So how is this relationship working? How you develop the activities when writing the news, the stories, and then moving back to drawings?
So Brian and I have known each other for 20 years, and we became friends as like writing partners. We worked at a day job together, and his background was writing and I was making comic books. And so as we became friends, we would email ideas, and it became very organic, the writing. And there's no one way we do it. Sometimes one of us has almost an entire idea or story ready. And sometimes we just have one idea and then the other person kind of picks it up and runs with it. And we live close enough that when we're writing actively, we'll get together every week and work for a couple of hours. And yeah, because it's been going on so long, I think we both trust each other. So, if he says one of my ideas is bad, I know that I know where it's coming from. And so I
It's
can kind of
honest.
look into it and, see why it doesn't work for him. Sometimes it's like he's an editor, and
Okay.
sometimes it's like he's a writer and I'm the editor. But we write out a story, and whenever we're happy with the story and think that's a good beginning, middle, and end, then I'll take it and start to turn it into a comic book, and show it to him or talk to him about parts of it as it's getting broken down. But he's not as interested in the making of the comics. He's much more of the writer. And so we write almost like short stories. And once we have a short story that I'm happy with, then I take that and I turn that into a comic book.
So how it is for you then to have the full script and go back to the drawings? You prepare everything and then you have a script layout, or is a more direct way of working?
I've worked every way. It depends on the story. It depends on the deadline. Sometimes I'll have a very tight script. It could almost look like a screenplay. All the dialogue is there and the panels are broken down. Sometimes I'll have one sentence for a page, and then I kind of write the page as I'm drawing. I do it at the same time, and it's, I guess you'd call it an outline. So it just kind of depends on how I feel, and what the story is like. If it's very complex, I find a script is a better thing to have, so that all the pieces
Sure.
fit together and you don't get to the end and realize you've missed some subplot or some character or something. So yeah, we write sometimes complete scripts and sometimes very loose, almost like a plot, almost like a Marvel method or something, where here's the idea, now go draw that, and then we'll finalize the words at the end.
But for as drawing, how much does it take for you to draw one page and complete it with inks and colors, etc.?
I usually try to do like 2 pages a week, and
Oh,
that's everything. It's lettering, color, and I
it's a good one.
usually, like with Street Angel, I would work 2 pages at a time. A spread. Open the book, and I would draw both of
Yeah.
those pages at once. And sometimes it's a little bit faster. It really, it depends on the page, but usually 2 complete pages in a week is an average week.
I particularly love the color script. I mean, the color that were used in the book, because there is a very strong alternative attitude in the color. There is something about the I don't know how to say. Is the level of the color is strong, is complete, is fulfilling the story, is giving an additional emotion. How it has been studied.
I love color. When I started, I was doing indie comics, or even self-publishing them, and they were just black and white. Color was expensive, and then it got cheaper for some reason. I guess international printing and digital printing, and so I started to be able to use color, and it's taken me a long time to get comfortable with it. It's very complex, but I love it. And so it's just, I look at color, I look at movies sometimes just for their color. Pixar published a big book that was their color scripts, and it's just almost like storyboards but with color. So there's a lot of ways to study color, and I try to learn as much as I can and find examples. And with Street Angel, it's very bright. A lot of it, her world is, she's homeless and she lives in a bad neighborhood, and it's dirty and browns and grays. But I try to find places to put bright colors in. One, because I love color, but I also look at movies that are desaturated and they're blue and gray. And I think, why? I look out the window, and especially in the spring, it's bright greens and blue skies. And I love those colors, and it almost physically feels good to my eyes, certain colors.
It's true.
And so that's what I try to put into my work. If it makes sense. Sometimes if you're doing maybe a horror story or something, that might not make as much sense. But these Street Angel stories, I consider them superheroes and action and
Yeah.
comedy. And I think there's a place for warm colors and exciting colors. And so because I do my own color, it is a part of the story. Sometimes in my scripts, I'll have notes on color before I've drawn anything, because,
No.
you almost see that at times. You see those colors and think like, all right, that's how this scene is going to be, and then you try to figure out how to make that work. I'll give you another example. When I did the Blacklight comic, Octobriana in 1976, I figured out how to print it with blacklight colors, blacklight inks, before I had any story. And I talked to my publisher about it, and I said, I think this will work, the production. And he said, yeah, I think it will. Let's do something. And it took me a year to figure out, like, what's a story that makes sense with this color palette.
Wow.
I had the color a year before I had a story. So, I think colors, I love color, and I hope it shows in my work.
It's a clear sense. You have the perception of how important the color are. So when you read the story, so it's one of the first thing that I noticed. So it's very good job.
That's so nice. I'm so happy to hear that. Thank you.
You're welcome. No, it's really well deserved. Uh, let's talk a little
I
bit.
wonder, can I say one more thing about color?
Yeah, please.
I wonder if color is almost like we don't have sound in comic books, and I wonder if color provides what sound might provide in film. Like musical scores or sound effects. It can create a mood in a way that maybe the drawings can on their own, but I feel like color can really enhance that and add to that experience.
It's a good point. Yeah, it's interesting. Actually, you're not the first one that you're telling me this thing about using colors like a support for the missing sounds. And actually, it is interesting because I had the same conversation with a creator from Italy, Emiliano Mamucari, that told me the same thing, and he told me that he studied the color script of Pixar too. So probably the things must be somehow connected.
Yes.
There must be some relation. Now I want to buy these books too because I am interested in this and I want to check a little more. Let's talk a little bit about Jess' mentality. I found it very interesting the fact that she's smart. She's even clever. She says that she doesn't want to wear a costume because it's much more easier to punch somebody when you are not so recognizable. So, how do you define her psychology, her character?
Well, I think that whenever you have something bad happen to you, let's say it's weird to talk about serious subject and then street angel, but I often think like, how does somebody get through that? I'll have a friend maybe go through a hard experience or a loved one go through a hard experience, and I think I don't know how you do that, but I don't know that you have a choice. You sort of have to just keep going, whatever the obstacle is in front of you. And I think that's what I see in Jessie. What choice does she have but to kind of keep looking for food and keep sort of fighting threats that show up against her. So in a way she's very pragmatic, but also I don't think she thinks about it the way we are thinking about it. Like for her, this is what happened on Tuesday. A team of evil scientists broke out of prison and threatened her neighborhood. So it's a lot of what's in front of her. She lives kind of moment to moment, and if that moment involves some werewolf showing up, uh, she has to deal with it. And she doesn't have a lot of resources, so she's left to her own devices to manage this. And I think she approaches her whole life is that way, whether it's digging around for food and looking for food whenever she feels hungry, or if it's some supervillain that shows up and attacks the city and nobody else is doing anything, so it's up to her to try to survive that. So she's just she just goes forward unless she sees a better plan. And like you said, she is smart. Not necessarily book smart. She doesn't
No.
always go to school, but smart enough to figure out how to foil these plans that the bad guys come up with.
It is interesting because in the second story, the one with the gang, uh, she plays dumb because she only seems that she wants to have something to eat, and in the end, she has a plan to defeat the gang. So it is interesting because that was the story of the tree that seemed more of a manga story. That was more an Oriental influence in spite of the first and third one in the book. And also I got the impression that when you created the characters from the Bleeders, the gang, you had a hell of a laugh because they are very very fantastic characters. So you all see the fun that you had in writing them.
Yeah, they're you try to find a way to make new superhero stories interesting, and so you
Yeah.
can take what would normally be a gang of supervillains and you make them like a 1980s street gang from a movie or something. And they have a lot of the same qualities. So yeah, it's just a chance to have fun and play with that stuff. And I grew up with movies like The Warriors, and
Yeah.
that was almost a motif throughout the 80s of like the colorful street gang. um so a lot of this stuff comes from my own things that I grew up enjoying, things that I remember liking as a kid, and you kind of work them in. And I'm glad to hear that you found Street Angel Gang, different than the other two stories, because that's part of who Jessie is too. I don't want her to be too simple. I want her to interact with the world differently from story to story, because if you meet somebody, you know, I'm different around my best friend than I am around my wife, or I am around my parents, or
Sure.
I am on this interview. So I want Jesse to come across that way too. And I never write, we never write like narration from her point of view. And I've had people ask me about that, and I say, I don't know. I can see what she does in these stories, but I don't necessarily know her that well either. So, to go from the Street Angel gang to superhero for a day, I hope it kind of makes her a more complex character, because the stories are different, and what she's doing is different from story to story.
Yeah, in fact, speaking about superhero for a day, it's more or less the Hal Jordan story, origin story, retold by a different angle. So it's more a Star Sapphire, but it's there, and it's interesting because it's the first moment in which we notice that Jesse is really a superhero, because she talks with Captain Alpha, and she discusses with him. It's not only a supposed superhero. So it was nice to see also this angle from the character, and you're right. In the three stories, you've got three different perception of the main character.
Yeah, that's very important to me. Because the other thing I outgrew with superheroes is they can be formulaic. It can be the same thing over and over. And in American comics, that could be for hundreds of issues of just the same. So trying to figure out ways to make interesting stories around the character is something that I'm attracted to. I work different than the typical Marvel superhero books where you're doing one every month with a team of creators. It's just me. So for me to do one of these books, it takes longer. And I want it to be something that's different than what I've done before, or something that I'm excited. I have some idea that I think is new that I'm excited to show people. So it's a little bit of a different approach.
So how do you think the stories of Jess will go on? Do you have some other stories in planning, or do you will have take time for doing other things at the moment?
Right now, I've been doing a big Hulk book for Marvel. And so that's been
Okay.
taking up a lot of my time. And I probably have a couple of more months of wrapping that up. And then I don't know what I'm going to do next. I may do an art book. I do collections of notebook drawings, and they're all out of print. So I've been thinking about doing a new notebook drawing, like a big book of all of my notebook drawings, and then doing some new ones for that. So I'm not positive what I'm going to do next. Like I said, it's been a busy, COVID has been kind of a busy time for me. So once I finish the Hulk, I'll probably take a little bit of time off and kind of think about, what makes sense and what I have ideas for. But the nice thing with Street Angel, we've been doing Street Angel stories on and off for almost 20 years now. So it's a character that I will do more Street Angel stories, but I don't know exactly when I will
Sure.
get around to those.
Speaking on COVID, as a creator, do you feel that at a certain point we will start reading stories in which COVID is involved? Because my perception of the last 2 years is that authors tend to avoid the the big C at the moment, because of course it is something that is very concrete and present in the life of everybody. But I guess that maybe 1 or 2 years from now, when things will be a little bit different, we will want to look back at this moment and understand, try to study this period from a different perception.
Yeah, I'm sure it'll, that we'll get to a day probably when we're tired of COVID stories. But I'm sure it's something that people will write about and make stories about probably for the rest of our lives. It's one of the biggest events probably most of us will ever have lived through to this point. So I'm sure it will influence storytelling for a long time, maybe generations.
Yeah,
Some of the great storytellers, they may be children right now. I think this has been a really strange experience for kids, from staying home
indeed.
from school to wearing masks at school. I think I'm sure it will infiltrate storytelling in a major way.
One question that makes everybody that I'm interviewing hates me. So it's one of the last. I keep it for one of the last. as a drawer, which is your relationship with the white space? That moment that there is between one square, drawing the square, and the other. Which what happens for you in that period?
I have no problems with white space. I tend to do drawings like I do a lot of sketches, and I'll sketch directly on, if I'm doing comics, I'll sketch directly on my script. I often print out my script so I can carry it with me and work on it at any time, anywhere. And I do my first drawings right on there. And so it's not a blank page. It's not a white page. And I have all these little, the drawings are this big, and maybe I do 20 of them, just filling up the page with this stuff. So when I sit down for a white page, I probably have some drawings, if not sketches, laying around like very clear in my head. And I make templates.
Okay.
And so I print those templates out usually in light blue. And whenever I sit down at the page, it's not a white page. But I do have a good story about this. I did a story. This is another Street Angel story that I did, where she is arrested and goes to juvenile, like she's in juvie, basically arrested. And so it's very structured. And I made all these templates that had like the blue lines for each panel, and everything is a grid. All the scenes are different grids. So like the 9-panel grid, 6-panel grid. And of course, there's no prison on earth that can hold Street Angel. So she busts out. And whenever she busts out, I completely abandoned my templates and I went to just white pages. And I just freehand drew my pages of her freedom. And it was some of the most enjoyable drawing I've ever done in my life, because I had done the imprisoned sequences for, 2 months. Every day I was working on template kind of pages, very strict rules. And whenever I got to the white blank page, it was this freedom that the character had, but I had. And I remember that as like just a joyful drawing experience. Once I got rid of the templates and just went to the white pages, I still had some sketches and things in my script. So it wasn't completely, without ideas, but it was really fun to not have any lines ruled down on the page, and, not to measure out the page, but to just kind of go in and start drawing and not worry if the panels were different sizes or if the borders weren't straight. And like I say, one of my best drawing experience. So maybe I should approach the blank page more often.
It's a good metaphor. The moment that she escaped, you moved from one kind of to the other. It's interesting. One thing, Jim, we are very close to the end of this interview. Which is the latest interesting graphic novel that you read in the last weeks?
Oh, wow. I read a lot because I do a YouTube channel, and we typically do one video a day, which is about a comic or, a graphic novel.
Yeah,
And,
you know the drill.
You have me panicking. This is the question. This is my white page question, by the way, because my brain is always fried. I've gone through Eric Stanton's work. I spent some time with his comics this week. And actually, for a couple weeks, I read a biography of him, and then I had a collection of his comics. And he's a fetish artist from, I guess he started working in the late 40s, or early 50s, and then worked up until he died in the late 90s. And he's fantastic. Like his craft, his skill is at a very high level. And he worked, he made comics, but they were outside of any real direction. In the early 70s, the last like publisher that he really worked for or that paid him to create certain work went away, and he started just making his own work. And so for, 20 years, 30 years almost, he just worked on his own, self-publishing and selling his work himself, and was very successful at it. And so I spent a bunch of time looking at his work this week, and it's really good comics, and it's unique. The comics he made. He went to school with Steve Ditko, and he and Steve Ditko shared a studio for 10 years. Around the time that Ditko was at Marvel doing Spider-Man and Doctor Strange, he was sharing a studio with Eric Stanton. So like Eric Stanton is coming from a very comics, centric place, but at the same time, he wasn't really working in comics the way most of my peers work in comics. And so, it allows his work to be different in a way. So that stuff was in my head this week, and
Wow, nice.
was pretty interesting.
Sounds good. And if you had the opportunity to draw or write a story for whatever character already published in the world, what would you choose?
I would choose the Hulk. The Hulk. I had a
Really?
chance to do any Marvel character that I wanted to, and the Hulk was my dream character. So it's a fun question, but I
Yeah.
tell you, that's what I've been doing for the last year, and it's been a blast.
Wow, that's good. It's the first time that somebody mentioned the character as a wish list.
Yeah, I feel very lucky for that. It's been a great experience. I guess number two, the character that I haven't gotten to do yet would be Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles.
Okay, of course.
Yes.
Who knows? Maybe next time. So good to know. Jim, it's been really a pleasure to talk with you. The Leviathan books will be out on the first weeks of February, so we are almost there. So really, thank you to this conversation. It's been very, very nice to have some times with you. If you want to come back and talk with us, it will be a really pleasure. So feel free to feel yourself at home with us. And really, really thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. This has been fantastic. Thank you.
You're welcome. E per chi ci ha seguito, naturalmente le opportunità, la trasmissione andranno avanti e ci vediamo domani con la solita puntata del Flywheel Show. Ci vediamo a tutti. Ciao. Bye Jim.
Bye.